Hello and welcome to our training on understanding neurodiversity. I'm your presenter, Max Hornick, Community Education Coordinator for Disability Network Southwest Michigan. My pronouns are they, them, and theirs. Disability Network Southwest Michigan is one in a network of 15 Centers for Independent Living in the state of Michigan and approximately 400 nationwide. If you are in the state of Michigan, you can find your local Center for Independent Living by going to the Michigan Statewide Independent Living Council website, misilc.org, and clicking on the Resources tab. Or if you are outside Michigan, you can usually find your local Center for Independent Living by Googling your state and county name along with the words Centers for Independent Living. The image on our first slide is the Disability Network Southwest Michigan logo. I've also provided my contact information so you can follow up with me after the training if you need to. This training is brought to you by Disability Network Southwest Michigan's Paving the Way to Self-Determination program. Paving the Way to Self-Determination is a program for families of children with disabilities, which helps provide resources and training to help prepare children to live an independent and self-determined life. Paving the Way to Self-Determination is a collaboration with the Michigan Developmental Disabilities Council, the ARC Michigan, Michigan Alliance for Families, and Charting the Life course. It is made possible through funding from the Michigan Developmental Disabilities Council. The images on this slide are logos for all of our Paving the Way to Self-Determination partner agencies. We like to start our presentations with the definition of a disability because we've found that every person has their own idea of what a disability is. The Americans with Disabilities Act, or ADA, says a person with a disability has a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities. Major life activities are things most people need to do every day, like walking, talking, reading, writing, and major bodily functions like eating, sleeping, or breathing. To prevent discrimination on the basis of disability, the ADA also protects people who have a record of such impairment and people who are regarded as having such an impairment. A developmental disability is any lifelong disability that is acquired prior to the age of 22. This could be something a person was born with, or it could be something acquired before age 22 through illness, injury, or trauma. The image on this slide shows a group of 10 young adults standing in front of our Kalamazoo office building. Some people might look at this photo and say, I don't see any disabilities. But all of the people in this picture have a disability. Most disabilities are what we call non-apparent disabilities. It's very important to keep in mind that most of the time, when a person has a disability, you're not going to be able to tell just by looking at them. And usually when you can tell just by looking at the person, it's the assistive technology they use that you're seeing, like a mobility device, hearing aid, or a communication device. Now that we know what disability is, let's dive into neurodiversity. What is neurodiversity? Neurodiversity is a term that was coined in autistic web forums during the mid to late 1990s. So in the early internet era, autistic people were going online, talking to each other on discussion boards, and they came up with the word neurodiversity to describe the wide range of variations in the human brain and mind. These variations could include things like biochemical differences, structural differences, electrical differences, or developmental differences in the brain. The existence of neurodiversity in itself is a scientific fact, not a philosophy. It is a fact that human brains differ. And like other forms of human diversity, neurodiversity is a feature of groups, not individuals. So just as one single person cannot be diverse, a single individual cannot be neurodiverse, but a group can be. For example, Disability Network has a neurodiverse staff because people with lots of different types of brains work here. The image on this slide is a blue square with an icon showing the outline of a person's head and their brain highlighted in white. So let's talk about some of the common terms that come up when discussing neurodiversity. All of these terms are pretty new to the English language within the last 20 to 30 years, and so probably a lot of you are not very familiar with them. I want to make sure that I'm providing you with some shared vocabulary as we go into this training today. The first word I'm going to discuss here is neurodivergent. Neurodivergent is an adjective that describes having a brain that differs significantly from the societal norm. And this could be something that's present from birth or something acquired later in the lifetime. This is an inclusive umbrella term. It was coined by Cassiana Asasamas, who is a multiply neurodivergent neurodiversity activist. Multiply neurodivergent, meaning this person has multiple brain-based disabilities. Sometimes online, you might see the word neurodivergent abbreviated using the letters ND. And this term includes all brain-based disabilities. Some people hear it and they think of autism or maybe ADHD, and that absolutely is included, but it has always been intended as a much broader term. It also includes other types of neurodevelopmental disabilities, psychiatric diagnoses, epilepsy, learning disabilities, intellectual and cognitive disabilities, brain injuries, and any other neurological disability. Things like migraine, Alzheimer's. It also includes people who are deemed as quote unquote gifted. As a person who was labeled gifted as a child, I participated in gifted student programming from kindergarten through 8th grade. I really believe the vast majority of so-called gifted students are neurodivergent in other ways as well. But because we succeed academically, the areas where we struggle tend to be overlooked. And unfortunately, that's why it's very common for so-called gifted students to experience burnout or a mental health crisis in adolescence or adulthood when the burden of all the new societal demands as people grow and mature finally overwhelms our ability to cope. So I'm not a huge fan of the term gifted personally, but the reality is that a lot of gifted people are neurodivergent. The next word I want to talk about is neurodivergence, and this is a noun that just means a brain difference. It's a brain difference. It's the thing that causes someone to be neurodivergent. Neurotypical is an adjective that describes having a brain with normative functioning. So if a person is neurotypical, their brain works more or less in the way that society expects and is designed for brains to operate. Sometimes you might see this abbreviated with the letters NT. And so notice here, I said normative, not normal. Neurodivergent brains are also normal, right? Normative here means this is looking at what are the norms and expectations within a society and a culture. And so I usually find the word neurotypical to be most useful when looking at cultural expectations. I don't usually describe a person as neurotypical unless they've already identified themselves that way to me, because I don't live in their head. I don't know what it's like to work with their brain. And so it's very useful, though, as sort of a sociological term to look at what is the expectations in our culture? How are we designing our systems, our education systems, our employment systems for brains to work? Allistic is an adjective that describes a person who is not autistic. And I included this term because sometimes I see people misuse the word neurotypical when they really mean allistic. So for example, I have seen a person described as neurotypical with bipolar disorder. But Bipolar is a form of neurodivergence. You get diagnosed with bipolar because your brain is working in a way that differs significantly from the societal norm, right? And so probably what that person meant was that they were allistic with bipolar. The image on this slide is a rainbow infinity symbol, which represents the full spectrum of human neurodiversity. This symbol was popularized within the autistic community, but it is used by other neurodivergent people and allies as well. If you want to learn more, I included a link on this slide to an article called Neurodiversity, Some Basic Terms and Definitions. It's written by Dr. Nick Walker, and she goes a lot more in depth on these terms, as well as some other terms that I don't have time to cover with you today. Now that we have a shared vocabulary to work with, let's talk a bit about the neurodiversity movement. The neurodiversity movement is a human rights movement and a social justice movement for people with brain differences. This movement is very broad, and not everyone involved in it has the exact same beliefs. But in general, the neurodiversity movement applies the social model of disability or a holistic model of disability to brain-based disabilities. The social model of disability is the idea that we're more disabled by the society we live in than our bodies or diagnoses. It's the way society is organized that disables people. The holistic model says people might be disabled by their differences alone, by their interactions with society alone, or by a combination of both. On the slide, I included a link, the holistic model of disability, and that is a blog post that has a lot more information on models of disability if this concept is new to you and you'd like to learn more. The neurodiversity movement was started in the 1990s by autistic rights activists, but it's not exclusive to autism. In many ways, the neurodiversity movement is philosophically aligned with the Mad Pride movement of people with psychiatric diagnoses and the self-advocacy movement of people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. The neurodiversity movement generally advocates for social acceptance and inclusion of people with brain differences, and it believes that therapies and medical treatments should support a neurodivergent individual's needs and goals, not make them appear quote unquote normal. In other words, the neurodiversity movement believes that what society considers normal is not superior. The image on this slide is a black and white photo of a brain in a jar labeled, "Do not use this brain, abnormal." The truth is that neurodivergent brains are normal. It is normal that human diversity exists, including within the way our brains work. And so neurodivergent brains, I use my neurodivergent brain every day. It does most of the things that I need it to do. And the better that I learn to understand the way it works, the more I can work with it instead of always fighting against it. And that's one of the most beautiful pieces of learning about neurodiversity, is learning to work with our unique brains instead of fighting them. And so I keep mentioning differences. So let's talk about some of these differences. Neurodivergent people often experience differences in sensory processing. We may have a very high sensitivity to sensory input, or we may have a much lower than average sensitivity to sensory inputs. People with that high sensitivity might try to avoid getting too much sensory input, and people with lower sensitivity might seek out lots of sensory input. A person could be sensory avoiding sometimes and sensory seeking other times, or maybe we seek lots of sensory input from one sense while avoiding sensory input from another sense. For myself, I know I tend to seek out lots of tactile sensory input and avoid too much visual and auditory sensory input. People with sensory processing differences can become increasingly sensitive to a stimulus with prolonged or repeated exposure. So it's really important to accommodate neurodivergent people's sensory needs rather than trying to force us to get used to a sensory stimulus. So if you think about, let's say, an annoying fan noise that's in the background, for a neurotypical person, this annoying fan noise that's in the background, they might notice it at first, and then after a little bit, they'll tune it out. They can tune out that background noise that's annoying them. For some neurodivergent people, we can't tune it out. And for some neurodivergent people, that fan noise, their brain and body might not just be processing it as annoying, their brain might be processing it as physical pain. And so when we experience a sensory input as pain, continued exposure to that isn't going to make us get used to it. It actually could lead us to develop chronic pain later in life. And so that's why sensory accommodations are so important for neurodivergent people. The image on this slide shows an outline of a person's face wearing large red ear defenders. They look kind of like big over-ear headphones, and they help reduce volume for this person. That's just one example of a sensory accommodation a person might make for themselves. For me, if I'm going to be in a space with fluorescent lighting or bright lights, I'm going to be wearing sunglasses as a sensory accommodation for myself. If I am going to be somewhere particularly loud, I might put in earplugs to go to that space. I don't like the over-ear defenders. They bother me. So I prefer, for my sensory needs, those in-ear earplugs. One of the ways that people might try to accommodate their sensory needs is by stimming. A stim is a self-stimulatory behavior that helps a person regulate their sensory input and oftentimes express their emotions. All people stim sometimes, but neurodivergent people might do so more often or in ways that are perceived as less socially acceptable. So this could be done with any sense. For a lot of people, repetitive motions like hand flapping, rocking could be a stim. It could also be a vocal stim. Maybe there's just a phrase that a person likes to say over and over. It feels good to say it and hear it. Maybe there's a particular song they like to listen to on repeat. It could also be a visual stim. They might be really looking at things with bright colors quite a bit. And so stimming can occur with any sense. And this is really a great way for people to self-regulate. And the emotional expression piece of stimming can vary from person to person. I know some people who flap their hands when they're feeling very excited and enthusiastic. But for me, if you see me flapping my hands, I'm going to be doing that because I'm extremely stressed out and I'm trying to get the bad feelings out of my body. So stimming body language can be different from person to person. Most people tend to be familiar with 5 senses: sight, hearing, taste, smell, and touch. But the human body actually has other sensory systems, and neurodivergent people often process these differently as well. So they can be really important to know about. One of these is interoception. Interoception is the sense that detects internal sensations within our body. It's how we know when we feel hungry or thirsty, how we recognize when we need to use the bathroom, and how we know we're in pain. Some neurodivergent people really struggle to identify sensations within our bodies, while other neurodivergent people might be extremely sensitive and notice every tiny bodily sensation. Difficulties with interoception may also contribute to alexithymia. Alexithymia is difficulty identifying or describing one's own emotions. If you think about the way people talk about feelings, sometimes they'll say things like, "Oh, I've got butterflies in my stomach," when they're experiencing anxiety. Well, if you think about that, butterflies in your stomach, that's a physical body sensation that's happening inside your body, right? And so if you aren't noticing and aren't picking up on those internal body sensations, it can be really difficult to identify the emotions that go alongside them. Neurodivergent folks who struggle with interoception might need some reminders to check in with their body. I tend to experience kind of a delay in my emotional processing. I don't usually process how I feel about something until later. And I always felt like a weirdo when I was a kid because I did theater, and the night of the final show, all the other kids would be like crying, hugging each other. "I'm going to miss you so much." And I just felt kind of a blank slate until a week or two later. And I, spent a lot of my childhood feeling so odd. Like, am I an alien? Am I a robot? Why am I not feeling the same way as the people around me? And now, as an adult, I've learned, oh, it's because of my neurodivergence. I just process emotions differently, and I probably wouldn't have spent so much of my life feeling like I was broken if I had known that from a younger age. Another important sense to know about is proprioception. This is the sense that detects the movement and position of the body. Some neurodivergent people might have difficulty processing their body's location in space. This might impact our coordination. The vestibular system is the inner ear anatomy that contributes to our sense of balance or equilibrioception. Neurodivergent people might be especially sensitive to inversions or having our head upside down. I always wondered why I would get really dizzy and nauseated and feel just emotionally irritable when I would do chores that involved bending over and standing back up a lot. And when I was researching for this presentation, I found out it's because I'm sensitive to vestibular input. So now, if I need to fold the laundry, instead of doing it standing up, bending over and standing up a bunch, I can do it sitting down and accommodate myself better. Conversely, keep in mind, neurodivergent people, we differ from the norm, and we also differ significantly from one another. There are people who seek out lots of vestibular input. If you know somebody who loves spinning and flips and is, doing somersaults all the time, it might be because they really enjoy that vestibular input that they're getting from that. Movement differences are also common among neurodivergent people. Differences in proprioception are one reason that neurodivergent people may move differently than neurotypical people. The image on this slide shows a person's feet in white sneakers standing on their tiptoes because toe walking is a common movement difference among neurodivergent people. And just anecdotally, I know that neurodivergent people are more likely to experience joint hypermobility, and I've noticed for myself that I'm a lot less likely to hyperextend my knee joints if I walk on tiptoes than if I do a traditional heel-toe flat-footed walk. We talked about stimming in relation to sensory differences, and repetitive movements like rocking, hand flapping, and other types of fidgeting are very common stims for neurodivergent people. Another concept that might impact our movement is executive functions. These are the mental processes that direct goal-oriented behavior. For people with strong executive functioning skills, when they want to complete a task, they can envision the steps for how to get there. Neurodivergent people may struggle with executive function. Sometimes we don't see the steps to get the task done. We just see this overwhelming giant wall of task. Some people with ADHD have referred to this as the wall of awful, which is made up brick by brick over a lifetime of failures, disappointments, and rejections. So, seeing a wall instead of the path to get where we're going can make it really hard to get started on a task, including just initiating physical movement of our bodies. Sometimes we might need help figuring out how to get over the wall, breaking down that task into much smaller steps that seem easier and less overwhelming for us. Apraxia and dyspraxia are brain differences that disrupt motor planning. When a person has apraxia or dyspraxia, our brain knows we want to move, but the message is somehow disrupted on its way to telling our body to move. Dyspraxia is sometimes known as developmental coordination disorder, while apraxia is the term most commonly used when talking about speech, but it can affect other types of movements as well, not just talking with your mouth. I personally experience non-speaking episodes sometimes, and when I have these, I can think of the words I want to say, but I can't coordinate all the movements necessary to make my body talk. So I will use text-to-speech apps like Speech Assistant on my phone or Talk for Me on my PC to communicate during those times. For me, I have many years of typing experience. The letters are always in the same place on the keyboard, so I know the motor plan extremely well. I only have to figure out how to move my fingers, and my brain doesn't have to figure out how to move my diaphragm, my lips, my tongue, my jaw, and my vocal folds all in the exact right way at the exact right time, like I do for talking with my mouth. The text-to-speech apps I use are just one form of what's known as augmentative and alternative communication, or AAC. AAC is a term for communication methods other than oral speech. These other communication methods might augment or add to our speech, or they might be an alternative, a substitute for talking with our mouths. For people with apraxia, large body movements, like moving your arm to point at a symbol or letter, may be easier to develop than the very fine motor skills you need for speech, or even typing fine motor skills. There are a lot of different forms of AAC that neurodivergent people might use to communicate, such as letterboards, picture communication books, or symbol-based speech-generating communication apps. American Sign Language is not considered a form of AAC because it is its own separate language. However, some neurodivergent people have found that sign language is a more accessible way for them to communicate than spoken language. I acknowledge I have a significant degree of speech privilege as someone who can rely on spoken language to communicate most of the time. So I did include an additional learning link called The Top 10 Things You Know About Apraxia According to a Non-Speaker. It's a really good read that you should check out on the additional learning slide. Some neurodivergent people may also experience motor disinhibition or involuntary body movements. I've experienced this in the form of echolalia, or repeating something I've heard. I remember having a conversation with a coworker a couple years ago, and I interrupted her only to just repeat the last half of her sentence. It was not intentional. I actually clapped my hand over my mouth afterward in embarrassment because I didn't know what had happened. Since learning more about neurodiversity, I understand that echolalia is just a different way of processing language, and I wouldn't have been embarrassed if I had understood that about myself. Vocal tics or motor tics that people with Tourette syndrome or other tic disorders experience are another example of motor disinhibition. A lot of people with motor disinhibition and people with apraxia or dyspraxia describe their experience as a brain-body disconnect. So with apraxia, the brain is telling the body to move and it's not doing the movements you want, whereas with the motor disinhibition, the body is moving in ways that your brain didn't intentionally, consciously tell it to do. Now that we've covered movement, let's talk about communication differences. It's really important when we talk about communication and people with disabilities to remember that communication is a human right. And I would argue it's the most fundamental of human rights. It's very difficult to exercise any of your other rights if you don't have access to reliable, effective communication. So, disabled people deserve continuous access to robust communication systems suited to our unique needs and preferences. Diversity in social intelligence is a concept from research with the autistic community. Historically, there has been a belief that autistic people have a communication deficit, but new research has showed that neurotypical people are very effective at communicating with other neurotypical people, while autistic people are very effective at communicating with other autistic people. And so researchers have determined that there is a double empathy problem that occurs when an autistic and a neurotypical person interact. There are misunderstandings on both sides of that social interaction. It's not so much a communication deficit as a communication difference. Neurodivergent communication is often much more direct with less small talk than neurotypical communication, which some neurotypical people perceive as rude. But there are also forms of neurodivergence that might make a person a lot more indirect in their communication, especially if they have difficulty remembering or finding the words that they want to use. One common neurodivergent communication strategy is often known as info dumping, which is sharing a lot of information all at once about our passions. I prefer to call this info streaming because I feel like dumping has kind of a negative connotation. Sometimes when we info stream, neurotypical people think we're being too intense or dominating the conversation because there's a neurotypical cultural expectation of brief back and forth chatting as the conversation. Most social skills programs focus exclusively on teaching neurodivergent people to perform neurotypical social skills. As a result, neurodivergent people often learn to mask or camouflage our authentic selves, which is exhausting. If you've worked a customer facing job before, you'll know the experience of putting on your customer service voice. It's this facade. It's a form of emotional labor, and it's a relief when your shift ends and you can go home and just be you, right? But for some neurodivergent people, they're told they never get to take off the facade. They're told you've got to do this at school, at work, anytime you're in public, and at home. For autistic people, this can contribute to autistic burnout. I included a link to a guide on autistic burnout from the Autistic Women and Non-Binary Network if you'd like to learn more about this on the additional learning slide. Teaching both neurodivergent and neurotypical people about the diversity of social communication styles can be mutually beneficial. For example, if you tell a friend about an upsetting experience you had, a neurodivergent friend might share a story about an experience they had that made them feel similarly as a way of expressing empathy. A neurotypical friend might express their support by saying, "I'm so sorry you went through that. You didn't deserve it." If you are neurotypical, you might think your neurodivergent friend is trying to one-up you or make it about them by telling their own story. On the other hand, if you're neurodivergent, you might think the neurotypical friend's generic sounding response means they don't really understand or don't really care about what happened to you. But the truth is, neither of those responses is wrong. They're just different. So communicating with others about the way that you communicate, meta communication, can be extremely helpful for ensuring that the cross-cultural understanding across neurotypes is happening. The image on this slide is a drawing of a child chewing on a necklace. Text reads, "I look different when I listen. I may stare into space to focus on what I hear. A blank expression means I'm thinking. Rocking or quietly fidgeting keeps me calm and focused. Biting a rubber toy is better than biting myself. Sitting oddly may be more comfortable. If I'm disrupting others, please gently talk to me. This is Autistic Art from Miss Luna Rose 12 on Wikimedia Commons, and I thought it was a really wonderful depiction of neurodivergent listening body language. I did provide a handout that is an updated version of whole body listening that you can use with your child to help identify their own personal listening body language. Sharing your child's personal listening body language with their teachers may help instructors understand how your child learns best in school. One element underlying some of these communication differences may be differences in language processing. The most common way that people are believed to learn language is through analytic language processing. This involves learning one word at a time, combining words into longer phrases, and eventually forming sentences. But some people are Gestalt language processors. This means learning language through the use of gestalts or scripts, combining different scripts, and eventually forming your own original sentences. Most people learn to speak so quickly as toddlers that no one really notices what type of language processor you are, so these differences are more easily noticed in neurodivergent people who don't develop their speech or language skills along a neurotypical timeline. When a person is using scripts, it might be a line from a favorite book, movie, song, or TV show. It might be something I've heard my parents say a lot. And a lot of times when people are using these scripts, it's not necessarily exactly literal. The meaning of the script might be more an emotion that's attached to the script rather than the literal meaning of those words. So you might have to do a little detective work to figure out what that gestalt or script means to that person. Alexithymia may also contribute to these communication differences. Growing up, when people would ask me, "How are you?" I really struggled to identify how I felt. I'd spend several minutes describing everything that had happened to me that day, basically processing out loud to determine how I felt. And I really thought something was wrong with me because everyone else always just said they were fine, and I was never just fine. I was 17 when someone finally told me that most people just expect you to respond, "Fine, how are you?" And I was so embarrassed. I quickly learned that script to perform neurotypicality. And it then became an issue because I'd use that script in all situations, in places where it wasn't really appropriate. Like I've had a horrible day and I'm talking to my best friend and they ask how I am. Saying fine isn't appropriate there. Or maybe I'm going to see a therapist because I'm feeling depressed and they ask how I am. Saying fine, how are you is not actually a helpful or useful response in that situation. So I learned that script, but then I had to try in more recent years really hard to not always default to that script. And that's potentially one of the harms of, training neurodivergent people to always respond with the expected neurotypical social norms. So now that we know more about sensory, movement, and communication differences, let's talk about ableism towards neurodivergent people. What is ableism? Ableism is the systematic oppression, mistreatment, and marginalization of people with disabilities. A common feature of ableism is discrimination in favor of non-disabled people. The image on this slide is a blue banner that reads, "Nothing about us without us." This is the rallying cry of the disability rights movement because far too often non-disabled people are making the decisions that directly impact disabled people's lives. Ableism negatively impacts neurodivergent people's access to healthcare, housing, education, employment, and social opportunities. The image on this slide is artwork by Abigail Southworth depicting a woman with two heads. One of her heads is pale blue with dark blue hair and is frowning. The other is pink and yellow with red hair and appears to be laughing. Text surrounding the woman reads, "Life as a two-headed beast, bipolar. Pills make you weak. Stop feeling sorry for yourself. I keep trying to help you, but you don't want it. What do you have to be depressed about? What's wrong with you? Can't you just calm down? I don't get why you can't just act normal. Don't you have pills for this? We have a print of this artwork hanging up in one of our Disability Network offices, and I think it's a really good illustration of the impact of ableism on neurodivergent people. Imagine the impact of hearing comments like this on a daily basis. I included an additional learning link on the additional learning slide to an article called My Experience with Diagnostic Overshadowing. This article is written by a woman with a mental health disability, and she explains that far too often, doctors assume that her physical health symptoms are caused by her mental health diagnosis. Unfortunately, this type of misattribution may have negative health impacts for people with mental health disabilities. Research has shown that people with psychiatric diagnoses are disproportionately likely to die within 2 weeks of being released from the ER. I've experienced this sort of diagnostic overshadowing myself. In the spring of 2021, I went to the ER experiencing altered consciousness and a loss of voluntary motor function. The ER staff member who helped my partner get me out of the car because I couldn't stand at that point asked if I was having a seizure, but after we got into the ER, my partner disclosed that I had previously been diagnosed with bipolar disorder because I couldn't talk, so he was trying to share as much of my medical history as he could remember. And it was like a switch flipped. It seemed like the ER staff went from thinking, oh my gosh, this is a serious medical emergency, is this person having a stroke, a seizure, to trying to prove I was faking. And that's reflected in the ER doctor's notes. They say things like, the patient refused to respond to questions. I was not refusing to respond. I was really trying to move. I was trying to open my eyes. I was trying to talk. And my body was just not cooperating with me. And since then, I've learned that bipolar disorder was actually never a correct diagnosis for me. But even if it was, that shouldn't mean that I'm treated poorly in the ER. For people with learning disabilities, intellectual disabilities, and cognitive disabilities, ableism often shows up in assumptions related to their intelligence and devaluing people on the basis of their IQ score. Let's talk about some ableist labels. The image on this slide is an illustration from a eugenics text showing people on different steps of a staircase. This is titled Steps in Mental Development, Where They Stumble, the Limit of Development of Each Type. I am going to use some offensive language here in my image description because it is in the image, but I really wanted everyone to understand where these labels come from. The person sitting at the bottom of the steps is labeled idiot, mentally 3 years old and under. The first step is labeled self-preservation, and the person on it low-grade imbecile, mentally 4 to 5 years old. The second step is labeled simple menial work, and the person on it medium imbecile, mentally 6 to 8 years old. The third step is labeled simple manual work, and the person on it high-grade imbecile, mentally 8 to 10 years old. The fourth step is labeled complex manual work, and the person on it moron, mentally 10 to 12 years old. The top step is labeled work requiring reason and judgment. And so this image reflects the so-called mental age theory, which I've put theory in quotes here because this idea never had the evidence base of a true scientific theory. Mental age theory is just a belief from the eugenics movement that neurodivergent adults have the mind of a child. And so the eugenics movement is an ugly piece of our history where people encouraged forced sterilization of people with disabilities, people of color, and people living in poverty. I included an additional learning link called Mental Age Theory Hurts. And this is written by an adult with an intellectual disability about how harmful it is when people will say things about her and describe her mental age as being a child when she's actually an adult. These mental age labels really contribute to a lot of harmful stereotypes and assumptions about neurodivergent people. Some other labels that contribute to stereotypes and assumptions are functioning labels. Functioning labels rank a person's disability on a scale from high to low functioning or mild to severe. And these terms are really value judgments. Different people value different skills, and so different people might label someone high or low functioning. And oftentimes, these terms are used to deny accommodations for people who are labeled as high functioning, or to deny personal choice and autonomy to those who are labeled as low functioning. So, what should we use instead of functioning labels? It's a lot more helpful to talk about a person's strengths and the specific types of support or accommodations they need. This way, people can get their needs met, and no one is making negative assumptions about them based on stereotypes. Another ableist label is nonverbal. This term is not an accurate description of non-speaking people because the root word verbal simply means relating to words. As I said when we discussed AAC, many non-speaking people can use words in ways other than talking with their mouth. And so using accurate terms to describe non-speaking people helps support the understanding that they have a speech disability rather than leading to the assumption that they can't understand language. When we're talking about neurodivergence, it's important to remember that behavior is only the tip of the iceberg. The image on this slide is an illustration of an iceberg. The tip of the iceberg is poking out above the water, and it's labeled observable behavior. The larger part of the iceberg is underwater with labels pointing to different parts that say executive dysfunction, motor planning difficulties, trauma or emotional distress, physical pain or illness, unmet sensory needs, and inadequate communication tools. Unusual behaviors don't need to be fixed, stopped, or changed just because they're unusual. Stimming is a really healthy way for neurodivergent people to regulate our sensory input. And if a person is stimming in a way that's harmful to themselves or to others, you can work together to find alternative ways to meet their sensory needs. Self-harming or aggressive behaviors are likely to indicate that a person is experiencing emotional distress, physical pain, illness, or unmet sensory needs. And while behavior is an important indicator, it's also important to recognize that not all behavior is communication. We can often learn a lot from the behavior a person is exhibiting, but tics or motor disinhibition might cause people to do or say things they don't intend. And so it would be harmful to assume that a person's tics were voluntary and to misinterpret them as intentional communication. Applied behavior analysis, or ABA, and other techniques that manipulate a person's behavior through rewards or punishment can undermine their intrinsic motivation. Those rewards and punishments are external factors or extrinsic motivators that we use to motivate a person. And overusing them to force a person to comply with our wishes can diminish their intrinsic internal motivation by promoting a transactional view of human interaction rather than a relational one. Even if you're only using positive reinforcement, the absence of a reward can feel like a punishment to a person. Additionally, these methods can also make people with disabilities more vulnerable to abuse because they teach disabled people to unquestioningly comply with any demand that a person in authority makes. I did provide an additional learning link about this, which is the National Council on Independent Living resolution opposing ABA. Seclusion and restraint especially cause trauma, which then leads to more distress-based behaviors, which can lead to additional seclusion and restraint, creating a vicious cycle of trauma for people with disabilities. Neurodiversity affirming approaches are going to be those that promote autonomy and connection rather than coercing a person into compliance. Autonomy being that self-determination, that personal choice, and connection being those human relationships. Human beings are social animals. We really depend on connection with others for our well-being. If a therapist, educator, or parent values compliance over autonomy and connection, it's very difficult to provide trauma responsive and neurodiversity affirming support. To better understand neurodivergent behavior, it's very helpful to understand the different ways human brains and bodies may respond to stress. The image on this slide is an infographic depicting the stress cycle by Janae Elizabeth, the trauma geek. In step 1 of the stress cycle, we are in a safe and social mindset with our ventral vagus nerve engaged. For context, the vagus nerve runs from our brainstem and has branches that connect to our heart, lungs, and digestive system. The ventral vagus is the branch closer to the front of our body. And they describe this state of mind as, I am home. So safe and social might look different for different people, but this is when we're feeling comfortable and at ease. In step 2, we encounter a trigger or danger. Our neuroception, which is our nervous system's threat detection system, identifies a threat. And they describe this as, there is a tiger. But they go on to say that anything can be a tiger. Our genetics and life experience inform how we detect danger and threat. People with highly attuned neuroception sense danger more often than others. So who has highly attuned neuroception? Oftentimes that's going to be neurodivergent people and people with a history of trauma. In this stage, our body releases the hormones adrenaline and cortisol to prepare us for survival. The trigger leads to subconscious processing of the question, how can I survive? And so it's important to keep in mind this is subconscious. This is not happening in the logical, rational part of our brain that can think about rewards and punishments for behavior. This is happening in the emotional survival part of our brain that is just worried about making it out alive. So those survival strategies might include 1, authentic connection. Maybe there is a safe person I can go to and I will be good. Awesome. Sometimes that's not the case. Maybe we choose survival strategy 2, flight or avoidance of that threat. Maybe we choose strategy 3, fight, facing the threat. Maybe we've learned through our life experience that when we do flight or fight, we get put in seclusion and restraint, which feels like an even bigger survival threat. So maybe we've learned strategy 4, fawn. This is our faking, pretending, people-pleasing response. Our attempt to placate that threat and people-please our way out of this situation so we can hopefully survive. And that's some of the hazard of that masking or camouflaging of our neurodivergence, is oftentimes people end up in this survival mode of people pleasing, which is not healthy to be in survival mode all the time. Maybe we opt for strategy 5, we freeze, we just kind of go numb and dissociate from that threat. And hopefully when we kind of return to our body, that threat will be gone. Maybe we're even more overwhelmed than that and survival strategy 6 happens. We flop and just collapse in the face of this overwhelming threat. In step 3, we've selected based on our life experience what our survival strategy is going to be, and we experience mobilization, which is a burst of activation in our sympathetic nervous system, and or immobilization, which involves a burst of activation in the dorsal vagus nerve, which is the branch closer to the back of our body. And they describe this as escape the tiger. And so mobilization is probably going to happen with your flight and your fight. Immobilization is probably going to happen with your freeze and your flop. And your fawn is probably going to be kind of a combination of both depending on what you need to do for your people-pleasing response. In step 4, we make our way back to connection by re-engaging the ventral vagus, because we have escaped the threat, but we still have all this cortisol and adrenaline running through our system. So they describe this mindset as I am safe now. And they have a whole list of techniques for engaging the ventral vagus, including singing, humming, chanting, dancing, gargling, rocking, swinging, tapping, talking to a friend, conscious breathing, guided meditation, appreciating nature, bilateral stimulation, binaural beats, petting something soft, hugs, cuddles, and creative or spiritual activities. And the body releases the hormones oxytocin and serotonin and enters rest and digest mode as it returns us to that safe and social step 1 state. And I really liked this infographic because so many of the tips for engaging the ventral vagus are common neurodivergent stims, right? I also want to mention that small children are not capable of completing the stress cycle on their own. Small children need the presence of a safe enough person who can co-regulate with them to reach the safe and social state again. It's through the practice of repeated co-regulation experiences that children develop their capacity for self-regulation. I provided an additional learning link called Child Discipline, Time to Shift the Lens that provides additional information about the importance of co-regulation in child development. Human beings are social animals, so connection with others is critical to our well-being. Psychiatric hospitalization is often traumatic for people because it strips us of our autonomy and restricts our access to connection with family, friends, and community. I have only been hospitalized voluntarily myself, yet my experience with psychiatric hospitalization has also been traumatic. During a psychiatric hospital stay when I was 17, I experienced what I now recognize as psychiatric abuse in the form of seclusion and chemical, physical, and mechanical restraint. There are alternative models of support for people experiencing a mental health crisis, but unfortunately, they're not widely available in the US right now. I did include an additional learning link to an article on what the research has told us about peer-run respite. Peer-run respite is the idea of having a safe home-like environment with staff who are people with lived experience of a mental health crisis that can provide a space for people in crisis to go and spend the amount of time that they need while maintaining a connection with their community and maintaining their autonomy and accessing whatever forms of treatment they choose. Ultimately, a lot of the ableism towards neurodivergent people occurs because we are held to neurotypical norms that just don't fit us. One example of a neurotypical norm could be the idea that people should work during the day and sleep at night. That belief is harmful for people with insomnia or delayed sleep phase disorders. And it's also just not even true because we do need some people to work at night for our society as a whole to work. Another example is the idea that people should make eye contact while listening. That belief is harmful for autistic and other neurodivergent people who may experience physical discomfort or pain from eye contact. It's also something that's culturally constructed. In some cultures, direct eye contact might be considered rude. Another example is the idea that the spoken word is the best form of communication. That belief is really harmful to people who have speech disabilities. The image on this slide is a large blue question mark with the dot in the question mark forming the letter O in the word normality above dark silhouettes of a large crowd of people. So here's an activity for you to do at home. 1, describe a neurotypical norm that you've observed. 2, what are some examples of ableism that are rooted in that norm? And 3, how can we reframe our thinking about this norm to respect the richness of human neurodiversity? So for example, One norm I've observed is the idea that people should not engage in repetitive body movements. Some examples of ableism based in this is when people stop harmless neurodivergent stimming, tell autistic children to have quiet hands, or forcibly grab people and stop them from stimming. And so the reframe for this is really just acknowledging some people engage in repetitive body movements to regulate their sensory needs and emotional processing. This is the additional reading slide. I kept mentioning links to additional learning articles, and this is where you can find all of those, including the top 10 things you should know about apraxia according to a non-speaker, a guide to autistic burnout from Autistic Women and Non-Binary Network, the article on one woman's experience with diagnostic overshadowing, an article on how mental age theory hurts people with intellectual disabilities, the National Council on Independent Living resolution opposing ABA, Child Discipline, Time to Shift the Lens, which is an article all about co-regulation, an article on what the research has told us about peer-run respite houses, and a really wonderful blog post called Found in Translation, the Social Language Theory of Neurodivergence. This slide has links to resources where you can learn more about neurodiversity. Just as a disclaimer, Disability Network Southwest Michigan and I personally don't necessarily agree with every single perspective published by these resources, but they're all very helpful for learning more about neurodiversity, hearing more neurodivergent perspectives, and learning more ways to support neurodivergent people. So definitely check out any of the links on this slide, including Alliance Against Seclusion and Restraint, Association for Autism and Neurodiversity, Autistic Self-Advocacy Network, Autistic Women and Non-Binary Network, Autism Level Up, Collaborative and Proactive Solutions. And collaborative and proactive solutions is really an approach to how do we help people who are showing concerning behaviors without manipulating them through rewards and punishment. And the answer is really, how about you figure out what the real problem is instead of always just focusing on behavior, and you address that by working with the person instead of manipulating them. And so I definitely recommend checking that one out. Communication First, Foundations for Divergent Minds, International Association for Spelling is Communication, Madden America, Dr. Mona Delahook, Neuroclastic, Project Let's, Therapist Neurodiversity Collective, and I definitely recommend checking out some of their educational resources if you're thinking about pursuing some type of therapy for your child. The Thinking Person's Guide to Autism, and lastly, Trauma Geek, who provided that really great infographic on the stress cycle. And finally, don't forget to check out all of our partners in the Paving the Way to Self-Determination program. Centers for Independent Living, or CILs, are consumer-controlled, community-based nonprofit organizations that provide information and referral, advocacy, peer support, independent living skills training, and transition services for people with disabilities. Disability Network Southwest Michigan is just one of those. So to find your local CIL, go to ilru.org. Michigan Developmental Disabilities Council works to change systems to serve the needs, wants, and desires of people with developmental disabilities. For more information, please go to the link on the slide. Michigan Alliance for Families provides information, support, and education for families who have children and young adults, birth to 26 years of age, who receive or may be eligible to receive special education services. For more information, go to michiganallianceforfamilies.org. The ARC promotes and protects the rights of people with intellectual and developmental disabilities and actively supports full inclusion and participation in the community. To find your local ARC, go to thearc.org. And finally, Charting the Life Course is the use of framework and tools designed to help visualize ideas, vision, and goals, as well as problem solve and advocate for supports. For more information, go to lifecoursetools.com. Thanks.